They were the most beautiful women in the empire, so beautiful that it became a curse. Taken from their homes, renamed, erased from history, the concubines of Roman emperors lived in gold-lined prisons where silence was survival. They were not wives, not slaves, not citizens. They were possessions of power, used and then forgotten in ways that no death could free them from. What happened behind the palace doors was never recorded in marble, but the ruins still whisper. Because what Roman emperors did to their concubines was not just cruel, it was something far worse than death. It always began in silence. No crying, no pleading, no mothers clinging to daughters. Just a single scroll unfurled, and the name read aloud by a man who never met the girl he condemned. Some were the daughters of disgraced senators, some were captured nobles from newly conquered provinces, and some were simply too beautiful to be allowed freedom. Once chosen, they were no longer women, they were imperialis concubinae, and their old names were scratched out from all records. In the bright marble chamber they were brought to first. The girls were stripped bare, not to be shamed, but to be measured. Every scar noted, every freckle memorized, every angle of the face whispered about in the cool Latin of the physician scribes. The emperor would never see them like this, he preferred the illusion. They were painted, powdered, perfumed into something no longer human. But in this room, before the silks and sandals, they were dissected in plain sight. A girl from Thracia stood trembling while a guard pinched her cheeks and noted how they flushed. Another from Carthage was told to walk across the room naked just to observe the sway of her hips. Some cried, some didn't, but all understood one thing: they would never go home. Outside that chamber, a scribe waited with ink-stained fingers. As each girl was chosen, her family's census record was modified. Deletum. In some cases, entire family lines vanished from paper, as if to make the girl's origin untraceable. One girl asked what her new name would be. The matron laughed. "Whatever the emperor wishes to whisper before sleep," she said. And so the girls were branded without fire, their past smothered in silk and rose oil, their futures built atop a single, chilling truth: they were not there to live. They were there to serve, and if they were lucky, to be forgotten quickly, because being remembered by the emperor too long came with its own horror. One girl, young, golden-haired, born near the Germanic front, was not chosen that day, but she was kept. No one said why. Her name was never called. She waited in that marble room until nightfall, until the torches cast long shadows on the floor, until the doors creaked open once more. And when she finally stepped through, she walked not toward luxury but toward something cold, heavy, and hidden beneath the palace. She would not be seen again for 6 years, and when she returned, she would not speak. They called it the quiet wing, though no one dared call it anything aloud. It was a corridor of soft sandals, muffled steps, and walls so thick you could scream and never be heard. Within those stone confines, the emperor's concubines lived in golden stillness. At first glance, it looked like paradise. Velvet cushions, bronze basins of rosewater, harp music carried through lattice windows, and food so delicate it dissolved on the tongue. But none of the women spoke. They nodded, they bowed, they obeyed. Their mouths were painted but kept closed. Their laughter was forbidden unless requested. Even crying was punished because it made the air heavier, and the emperor hated heaviness. Each concubine was assigned a tutor, not to teach them Latin or poetry, but to correct tone. "Smile less with your teeth," one girl was told. "Tilt your head like you're listening, even if you are not. And always, never ask a question." One concubine, barely 16, once whispered a prayer before eating. A guard heard her, and the next morning, she was gone. Her room was immediately reassigned, her name never spoken again. The girls learned. They communicated with glances, with the tilt of a fan, with silence stretched so long it began to hum. Some, desperate to survive, began to forget their native tongues. A Greek girl once fluent in philosophy began to mutter numbers in her sleep, counting her own breaths as if afraid they might be stolen too. One of the older concubines, once favored, had her tongue sliced, not removed, just cut enough to swell and scar. She had spoken his name too intimately. Afterward, she sat in a windowless alcove, her mouth slightly open, her eyes distant, as if waiting for a bird that would never return. The most terrifying part wasn't the punishment, it was the rewards. A concubine who pleased the emperor with her silence might be gifted a ring, or a necklace, or worse, his attention. With it came nights spent beside him, and days watched more closely than a senator on trial. And then, just as quickly, she would fall from grace, and no one fell gently. One girl wore a gold bracelet that jingled when she walked. She laughed once, and the sound echoed in the marble hall. That night, the bracelet was found shattered, and her room was stripped bare. The next morning, a new girl arrived from Syria, wearing the same bracelet, perfectly mended, without a scratch. The others noticed. They always noticed. In the quiet wing, you learned quickly that beauty meant nothing, grace was survival, and silence was not just requested, it was ritual. Over time, even the walls began to seem like they were listening, and when one girl dared ask, "What happens if I speak his name?" another simply pointed to the bas-relief carved into the column. It was a mouth sealed with a snake. They called it the womb tax, though never out loud. In the quiet garden courtyards of the imperial compound, concubines walked slowly, palms resting over their bellies, not out of pride but fear. The emperor's child, if it grew inside you, determined your worth, but it could also be your death sentence. Conceiving was not a matter of love or fate. It was a calculation, a gamble, a whisper of danger wrapped in flesh. If a concubine bore a son, she was celebrated briefly. Then she vanished. No one saw her again. It was said she was taken to a remote villa where she could no longer be touched, where her body was no longer hers but a vessel for imperial blood. Daughters were less dangerous. They were taken, trained, married off to distant allies. But the mothers were not told where or to whom, or if their child survived the journey. Some never knew whether they had birthed a future empress or buried one. Miscarriage, however, was a crime. A concubine who lost a pregnancy was summoned by physicians, inspected, interrogated, often accused of sabotage. Did she drink something bitter? Did she fall on purpose? Was there a reason her womb rejected the seed of power? One girl, pale and soft-spoken, miscarried during her second moon. She was made to kneel for 2 days in the garden without food. She fainted 3 times. No one moved to help her. After the third collapse, she was carried away. Her shoes remained. Another girl, older, already faded from favor, tried to hide her pregnancy, fearing the emperor had tired of her. When her belly could no longer be bound flat, she was summoned. The matron who bathed her afterwards said nothing, only that the water turned red far too quickly. There were rumors of a hidden hall beneath the palace, a place where the barren, the punished, and the no longer useful were sent. Not to die, but to serve in silence, sewing robes for the emperor's dead, weaving shrouds for those who never reached the age of naming. They called them the stitching wives. Not wives in title, but in punishment, women who had held imperial life within them and failed to deliver something useful. It was whispered that some of them began to sew warnings into the hems, small symbols, unreadable to most, but meant for future concubines to see. A broken laurel, a bleeding dove, a cracked sundae, no one spoke of them. But sometimes, when a new girl was dressed for her first night with the emperor, she would run her fingers along the inner seam of her robe, and if her eyes widened just slightly, those who watched knew she had seen the message, and now she would understand. Her body was no longer hers, her womb was currency, and the tax could be collected at any moment. The room was lit like a temple, oil lamps flickering behind polished bronze mirrors, casting 100 versions of the same trembling face. They brought the women here one by one after an emperor died, after the funeral fires burned for days and the senators had bowed their heads. The widows were honored. The generals were remembered, the concubines were summoned. No records listed this room in the palace blueprints, but every emperor had used it. They called it the Chamber of Reflections, but it was not the reflections that frightened the women, it was the mask. Heavy, bronze, and cold, it sat in the center of a table like an idol, molded from the dead emperor's face. It captured his sneer perfectly, as though he had died mid-command. The women were told to confess anything they had heard, anything they had whispered in his bed, any names passed between kisses, any secrets too soft for walls to catch. If they told the truth, they would be spared. But they all knew what that meant. Spared did not mean freed. Spared meant silenced in a less public way. Some tried to lie. The guards always knew. They were trained to read hesitation like scripture. One girl, trembling and veiled in white, claimed she had only ever heard the emperor sleep. The guard beside her nodded. Then he reached into a black chest and removed iron cuffs, each engraved with lions. She was taken below. Her footsteps echoed like drops in a well. Another confessed too much. She spoke of senators and wine and promises made in drunken whispers. She gave names, dates, details. Her reward was worse. They praised her honesty, draped her in purple, paraded her before the new emperor. And then, without warning, she was sealed alive in the mausoleum meant for her former lover. Her lips were painted gold, her eyes left open. But it was the bronze mask that did the worst. When a concubine refused to speak, it was heated slightly, just enough to burn the mouth if pressed. The punishment was symbolic, they said, a reminder that only the emperor's words should be kissed. One woman, old enough to remember 3 reigns, knelt before the mask in silence. When told to confess, she leaned forward and whispered something into its mouth. No one heard, but when she stepped back, the guards did not move. They let her leave. That night, 3 senators were arrested. By morning, only 2 still had tongues. The bronze mask was cleaned, polished, returned to its pedestal, and the next girl was called in. She was 17. Her name had already been erased. Her hair was still wet from the ceremonial bath. She looked into the mirrors, saw herself multiplied into oblivion, and did not cry. When she kissed the mask, she did not flinch, but the skin on her lips blistered quietly, and from that day forward, she never spoke again. They were known only by their absence. One day a concubine would be seen walking the garden paths, her veil catching the sun, her sandals whispering over the stone, and the next nothing, her room swept clean, her robes reassigned, her name struck from the servant ledger with a single line of black ink. No illness, no farewell, just vanishing. Those who remained learned not to ask. To wonder was to risk joining them, but there were patterns. One girl kept a journal stitched into the lining of her bed cushion. She was a scribe's daughter, trained in secret by her father, before he was accused of falsifying grain tallies. Inside the tiny journal, she recorded the disappearances, date, name, chamber, last known location. By the time she reached her 20th entry, she noticed something chilling. Every girl who vanished had been seen entering the temple of Vesta for a private blessing, or summoned to the imperial shrine to light the emperor's candle. None returned. Those rituals were supposed to be symbolic, acts of devotion or purity, but over time, they became a sentence. The girl showed her journal to no one. Until one day, a laundress found it tucked beneath the girl's mattress, its final page unfinished. She, too, was never seen again. Stories filtered through the lower levels of the palace. A guard confessed, drunk and near death, that there was a room beneath the archives, sealed by a stone door with no handle. Inside, he claimed, were urns that bore no names. Some believed the missing concubines had been cremated there, without rites, without memory. Others whispered something worse, that they were not dead, but buried alive, preserved, hidden. One physician, long after the fall of the Western Empire, described in his memoir a strange discovery in an old well beneath Palatine Hill. Dozens of bronze plaques, each etched with only a single letter and a date. No names, just symbols, a circled O, a feather, a broken wheel. Beneath each plaque were bones carefully arranged, wrapped in silk, some with fragments of jewelry pressed between their teeth. The emperor who reigned longest was rumored to have kept a personal book of erasure. Inside it were pages of names, none longer than a whisper, and next to each, a mark. A black line for obedience, a red one for rebellion, an X meant disappearance. No burial, no record, no memory. That book was never found. But when a later ruler rebuilt the palace, Workers uncovered a hidden wall behind the concubines' quarters. Pressed into the plaster, beneath layers of faded fresco, were handprints, small, feminine, scorched into the stone, some overlapped, some clawed downward. And one, the smallest of all, had a single word scratched beside it in ancient Greek: I remembered. The banquet was whispered about for years, though no one dared speak of it directly. It was meant to celebrate the emperor's triumph in Germania, a lavish feast held not in the great hall, but in the hidden garden behind the east wing, where the air was perfumed with night-blooming jasmine, and no servants were allowed to linger. Only the emperor and his concubines attended, 50 of them, each chosen for beauty, obedience, and silence. They were dressed in bridal veils and white silks, summoned just before sunset, and told they would dine in honor of the gods who had granted Rome victory. No one questioned the gowns. No one refused the wine. Musicians played instruments so softly it seemed the strings might snap from fear. Golden plates were laid out, each with a single fig, a sliver of salted fish, and a piece of honeyed bread shaped like a coin. But the emperor did not eat. He drank only from a dark chalice, and as the moon climbed higher, his gaze grew still. One by one, the concubines fell quiet. Some had barely touched their food. Others had not touched it at all. They were not poisoned, at least not in the way one might expect. They remained upright, eyes closed, hands folded neatly in their laps as though in prayer. A guard who peeked through the lattice curtain said it looked like a room full of porcelain statues, so still that even the breeze from the garden did not move their veils. At dawn, 10 women walked out. No one knew why those 10 had been spared. Their faces were unreadable, lips pressed thin, eyes red but dry. When asked what had happened, they said only this: we praised him. The remaining 40 were found still seated, their bodies strangely preserved, their mouths sewn shut with golden thread, the stitches so fine they vanished into the skin. Each had a flower tucked into her hand, a white lily, sacred to Juno, the goddess of marriage. The banquet table was cleared within the hour, the bodies buried in a mass tomb beneath the reflecting pool. Years later, when the emperor died, the garden was sealed and overgrown, but every spring, lilies bloomed unnaturally thick in that soil, even after the gardeners tried to burn the roots. One woman, who had survived the feast, was later found sitting by the edge of the pool, humming to herself. When asked what song she sang, she replied that it was no song at all. It is the sound they made, she said, right before the silence. And when she died, her hands were found folded in her lap, and a golden thread had been tied gently, almost reverently, around her tongue. They were given black veils when it was time, not the shimmering silks worn in the emperor's chambers, but coarse linen, dyed with ash and wine. To the outside world, it meant mourning, but within the palace, the veil was something far more final, a mark of dismissal. Concubines who wore it no longer received summons. Their chambers were emptied. Their names, if ever spoken again, were followed by a pause. Some were seen leaving at dawn, escorted by guards through lesser-known exits that opened into alleyways or barren hillsides. Others were taken to ports and placed on ships bound for distant provinces, Cyrene, Baetica, sometimes even the desolate islands where retired generals built tombs to themselves. They were not sold, not freed, not killed. They were simply removed, but not all removals were equal. Some concubines, especially those once deeply favored, were forced into symbolic marriages, arranged unions with senators who had failed the emperor, as a form of punishment. One girl, once called the cypress blossom for the way her hair curled in rain, was married off to a man 3 times her age who had plotted against imperial tax reforms. She wore the black veil at her wedding. She never lifted it. Her new husband died within the month. Some said he swallowed coals after she whispered the emperor's secrets in his sleep. The cruelest fate was reserved for those who had truly been loved. Not used, not possessed, but loved. When an emperor showed too much affection, too many gifts, too many appearances in public, the woman became a threat. Love meant memory, and memory meant risk. These women were subject to the decree known only among the inner court as unscriptum vitae, the life unwritten. It was a ritual of erasure. Their portraits were scraped from walls, Coins bearing their likeness were melted down. Anyone who spoke their name more than once in a moon's cycle was punished. And in time, it worked. They vanished from art, from record, from language. Their statues were recarved into goddesses or left headless in courtyards as warnings. But erasure was never perfect. In the eastern wing of the palace, a single tapestry remained that bore a peculiar seam, its pattern suddenly broken by a red thread that looped in the shape of a woman's eye. No one dared remove it. In one census fragment, a scribe had attempted to blot out a name but pressed too lightly. Under the smear of ink, the letters remained, Clarita. Beside it, a notation in Latin, she knew him too well. And in the catacombs beneath Rome, where discarded relics of the palace were thrown, a stone basin was found with a phrase carved along the rim, too shallow to be seen unless struck by candlelight. I was loved, and that was my crime. They believed it was the tomb of an empress sealed in marble, untouched for centuries, hidden beneath the remains of a collapsed colonnade near Palatine Hill. The inscription was faint, nearly eroded, but still legible, Domina Sanctissima. Most assumed it marked the resting place of a noble wife or imperial daughter, someone granted the rare dignity of burial within the heart of Rome. When they opened the tomb, the air was stale, bitter with the smell of ancient oils and burnt cedar. But what lay inside was not one body, it was dozens. Layered, wrapped, tucked into silence. Each woman was bound in silk that had blackened with time. No names marked their shrouds, no jewels decorated their hands. And yet their hair remained braided, perfumed, perfectly preserved, as if waiting for someone to return. One held a comb, another, a small bronze bell with no clapper. But it was the tags that stilled the archaeologists, tiny bronze discs placed beneath each tongue, not names, not prayers, just numbers. And one, resting just above the ribcage of a younger girl, held something stranger, a coin. Its face was worn, but the emperor's profile could still be seen, warped as though melted by fire. Someone had tried to scrape away his image. Beneath that same body, wrapped in a separate piece of cloth, was a note, not parchment, not wax, but fabric dyed red, stitched with trembling hands. It read only 3 words in broken Latin: he lied always. Whispers spread quickly among the team, despite the secrecy of the excavation. These were not empresses. They were concubines, lost ones, forgotten ones, disposed of not with violence, but with ritual, buried beneath the woman meant to be remembered, like shadows behind a torch. Some believed this tomb had been reused to hide them. Others believed it had been built for them all along, a mass grave disguised as honor. A priest called in to bless the site refused to speak after viewing it. One of the workers claimed he saw something move, a breath, a twitch, a shift of silk too smooth for coincidence. No one laughed. Days later, after the tomb was resealed, one of the researchers, a woman who had catalogued the bronze tags, was found outside the site, her hands stained with oil. She had scratched a phrase into the dirt with her nails. They waited too long, and she would say nothing more. In the official report, the site was marked as a multi-individual ceremonial interment of unclear origin. No further investigation was allowed. But the soil atop the tomb cracked every spring, and lilies grew there without planting. Not the bright Roman lilies of celebration, but pale ones, silent ones, the kind left in doorways when someone never returns. If stories like this haunt you long after the screen fades to black, like and subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World. And tell us in the comments, what do you think was worse, being erased or being remembered too well?